I want to tell you a story about my friend Dee. She lives in a big city in Turkey, and that's where I met her. So a couple of years ago, Dee got engaged, and she really wanted to have her whole extended family come to her wedding. So it sounds simple, but it was actually a lot more complicated than she expected. That's because Dee is a Uyghur. The Uyghurs are a Muslim ethnic minority group, and they live in a place called Xinjiang, which is this huge region in northwest China. Over the past couple of years, in the name of national security, the Chinese government has systematically imposed a high-tech police state that is making nearly every aspect of ordinary life impossible for Uyghurs. If you are a Uyghur in Xinjiang, the government could tell you what you can and can't name your children, what apps you can have on your phone, what music you can listen to, even what kind of funeral you can give your parents after they die. And to enforce these rules, the government is using heavy-handed human policing and a bunch of brand new technology, things like DNA databases, cell phone surveillance, and iris recognition technology. All of this is to invade and monitor even the most ordinary aspects of life for the region's minority groups. So for Dee's family, that meant they had to jump hurdle after hurdle just to try to get passports so that they could leave China and go to her wedding in Turkey. And Dee couldn't even talk to them openly about this, so she had no idea what was going on. Dee kept waiting and postponing her wedding, hoping for some good news. Finally, Dee and her mom got on a video chat with their family back in Xinjiang. She asked them how everything was going, and they said it was all fine. But then one of her relatives held up a handwritten sign in the Uyghur language. It said, "We couldn't get the passports." Dee felt her heart sink. She held it together on the call, but after they hung up, she burst into tears. Dee knew that the reason her family couldn't say those words out loud was that they were worried about audio surveillance. And they were probably right to be afraid. If the police had heard what was going on in that call and they hadn't liked what they had heard, the results could have been catastrophic. When the surveillance state catches you violating one of its constellation of written and unwritten rules, you could be sent to one of the region's prison camps, where hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities are now being held. Not one of them has been charged with a crime. So from people who have escaped this prison system, we know that they're being force-fed party propaganda. And they're also being subject to things like solitary confinement, food deprivation, and other abuses. And what's more, it's clear that people who are making phone calls to family who live outside of China, especially in Muslim countries like Turkey, can be sent to these prisons just for that. It's because the government sees this as disloyal behavior and evidence of possible ties with extremist groups. So that's how something as simple as wedding planning turned into something that was far more sinister. So throughout its 70-year history, China's Communist Party has used lots of different ways to repress dissent. It's censored the press and developed networks of informants among citizens. So what's different today is that the surveillance is being ramped up in places like Xinjiang. And that's being done with the help of new technology that's enabling the government to vacuum up huge volumes of data about individuals. So Xinjiang within China is an extreme case. But a lot of the technology that's being used in Xinjiang is also in use in other parts of China. So for instance, train stations around the country are now equipped with facial recognition cameras. And in an ideal world, people who are caught on these cameras would be given a fair trial. But China is a country where criminal courts are convicting 99.9% of the accused. So it's pretty unlikely that anyone who's actually caught on one of these cameras is actually going to get that fair trial. So another obvious example is WeChat, which is the messaging app that people in China use for pretty much everything. For everything from ordering takeout, or hailing a taxi. So outside of China and most of the rest of the world, we've come to accept that apps like Twitter and Facebook have become our new de facto public square. So in China, the public square is WeChat. And it's subject to censorship and surveillance that's gotten more and more heavy-handed with time. So anybody who's used WeChat has their own story about censorship. I actually have one too. So after Chinese President Xi Jinping got rid of term limits, a lot of people were using WeChat to swap memes of Xi Jinping as Winnie the Pooh. So that's kind of because they look alike, I guess. So I was in a group chat, and a bunch of us were swapping these same kind of memes. But we figured out after not too long that a lot of the memes weren't even going through. So sometimes you can see censorship happening right before your eyes. China's also developing something called the social credit system. Basically, it's a network of government and corporate programs that pull data from different parts of people's lives. So that could include things like your education history and your grades, your performance reviews at work, and your behavior in public. So collectively, that data can be used to inform how you do things like buy apartments, secure loans, travel, and even how much you can pay to do those things. There are other big data programs that are more invasive still. There's one called the Police Cloud, for instance. That program pulls data from things like your health records and your religious background. The idea is to build profiles of individuals, especially minorities and dissidents. And it's also used to build out networks of people that you're friends with and that you associate with. So needless to say, without legal protections, the risk to privacy rights with these programs is pretty huge. At the heart of the social credit system is the desire to shape people's behavior by incentivizing them to behave virtuously. But part of acting virtuously, in the eyes of the Communist Party, is acting in ways that aren't a threat to the state. So in the end, these programs could incentivize people to police each other and to censor themselves. So these same kinds of incentives exist for Chinese companies. So take Tencent's WeChat, for example. WeChat has no incentive to set up end-to-end encryption or other user privacy protections. If it did, it could lose the Chinese market altogether. Chinese companies have worked hand in hand with the government to build the surveillance state. And many of them see Xinjiang as a lucrative market. But some of these companies have global ambitions too. There are plenty of Western firms that are making and selling surveillance tech, but Chinese companies are making the same technology cheaper and more accessible to buyers in the developing world, including governments with repressive histories of their own. So we're already seeing this happen in places as far-flung as Ecuador, where the police have set up a huge network of Chinese-made facial recognition cameras. But Ecuador's government in the past has also poured resources into spying on dissidents, opposition politicians, and civil society groups. And we're seeing these same kinds of dynamics play out in places like Malaysia, Nepal, and Ethiopia. So as this technology continues to spread, what Chinese citizens and people around the world need are strong, clear, and reliable privacy protections that can actually be enforced. And without these, it is almost a foregone conclusion that this technology will be abused. I have really fond memories of visiting Xinjiang all the way back in 2008. Back then, I remember traveling to a city called Kashgar, which sits on the ancient Silk Road. At the night market, there were people talking late into the evening, eating lamb kebabs and drinking pomegranate juice. When I visited again last year, it felt like a completely different planet. The little shops that used to play pop music now have bars in the front. And as you walk down the street, you can almost feel how anxious people are, because the only thing you hear all around you is the sound of police sirens. What's happening in Xinjiang matters, and it's not just because of what's being inflicted on the Uyghur people, although that is bad enough. It matters because it's a warning to all of us of what surveillance technology can become if it's in the hands of a government that's hell-bent on repressing dissent and minority groups. When we used to talk about abuses of surveillance tech, it was always a hypothetical. But what's happening in this corner of the world, it shows us that a version of that dystopian future is already here with us. I spent most of my career as a journalist in China, but I never really understood what mass surveillance felt like until I traveled to Kashgar. And as I left the city, I couldn't help but feel that it shouldn't have happened there, and it shouldn't happen anywhere else either. Thank you.